everybody. It's us, IS Gamer Girl.
Yar, and my name's Jackal-it-be. I don't know, I did sort of a stink face, so I just sort of rolled into a whole pirate thing.
I thought we were going to keep the bit of us trying to get rid of the double chins.
Yeah, we gotta make us look the least amount of American as possible. And a big thank you and shout out to everybody around the world that has been watching that rugby video. It blew up in ways that I never, ever would have expected, reaching numbers that I didn't even know were possible for a YouTube channel my size. So everybody that's watched it, I appreciate you. Thank you so much. We're trying to learn more, or at least I am. My girlfriend wanted to come along too and be a part of this journey as well, because she's like, ooh, sports? I don't know sports, but I would love to learn more about sports. Especially sports that happen outside of America as well, like rugby. And today we have found a perfect video called Rugby Explained for Americans, essentially, I think. So let me shut up. Let's get on into it in 3, 2, 1.
Rugby Explained for American football fans.
There it is.
To get things started, I want you to picture one of those wild plays at the end of some football games when there's no time left on the clock and the team with the ball needs to score a touchdown. So it's basically a mad scramble with a bunch of laterals and backward tosses with the hope that by doing this, they will eventually be able to break through the defense and score. You're watching some now, so it shouldn't be too hard to picture this.
No.
Now, imagine a game where every play is like this. So in our imaginary game, every play is this type of desperate, mad scramble. In this game, there are no forward passes. And in fact, a player on offense is not even allowed to fumble the ball forward or knock it forward accidentally. In this game that we're imagining, play doesn't stop when a player is tackled. The player just gives the ball to a teammate and the scramble continues. In this game, in order to score a touchdown, you actually have to touch the ball down on the ground in the end zone. And finally, imagine that no one in this game is wearing helmets or pads or anything like that. If you can visualize what this imaginary game might be like, you are well on your way to understanding rugby. In fact, rugby and American football more or less descend from the same game, which explains their many similarities. We'll get to the history of all of this later in the video.
Okay,
Quick
all right,
disclaimer.
Quick disclaimer.
Before we go any further, I just want to say one thing. The purpose of this video is to explain rugby for an American football fan.
That's
As was the case with
me!
my Cricket Explained
And
for
not
baseball
me.
fans video, which I highly recommend.
I don't know
this
much
video
about
is
cricket
intended
either.
as a basic starting point, and it comes from my perspective
Yes.
as an American-born sports fan. This
Appreciate
being
you,
said,
sir.
if you think I've left something out that's critical for a person to know if they want to understand rugby, or if you think that something needs to be better clarified, or if you think I've made an error, feel free to leave a comment.
Please.
The comment
This is coming
sections
from a
under my
place of
videos have been
ignorance.
overwhelmingly positive and
Teach.
helpful,
I would love to
and I ask
learn.
that you keep it that
I
way.
appreciate
The
you
two
guys.
I
codes
need
of
more
rugby.
pictures,
Now,
though.
if you want to understand rugby, the first thing to know is that there are actually two distinct versions or codes of rugby.
Male
And these
and
games are
female.
different enough from one another that they are usually considered to be two distinct sports.
Interesting.
The older and more widely played version or code of rugby is officially called Rugby Union. And Rugby Union will be blue for the purposes of this video.
Okay.
The slightly, but only slightly, newer code is called Rugby League officially. And this is the dominant version of rugby in Australia, especially on the East Coast, in Northern England, and in certain Pacific Island nations, including Papua New Guinea, where it's the national
Like
sport.
New Zealand?
Rugby League will be yellow for this video.
Blue and
Each
yellow.
of these games generally goes by the simple name rugby when it's being played. And sometimes they use the even more generic term football. So it's important to know which version of rugby you're watching, because again, they are different enough from one another that they are essentially
Got it.
different sports. Now, in the United
yet they're still
States,
both
the
rugby.
predominant form of rugby is Rugby Union. And this is the game that
That's
most
blue.
people are referring to when they just say
Blue.
rugby. And again, this is also the case internationally for the most part.
Like
Rugby
the
League
Olympics?
is much less common in the United States. In fact, Wikipedia says that there are only about 700 registered players in the U.S. However, international rugby
Very tight.
league
It's
matches
still a big
are
number,
shown
though.
regularly
It
in
is.
the U.S. by at least one
It could
cable
be
network,
nothing.
Fox Soccer Plus. So for some people in the United States, Rugby League might be the only version of rugby that they have available to them on television. Because of this, and because I know this channel has an international
dang.
following, and also because like you might go to Australia and want to watch rugby and need to know what's going on, we're going to be covering both versions of rugby in this video.
How is
We
it-
will get to what makes
Normally, I
each version
wanna
of
try to, like,
rugby
make jokes
unique
with these, but
later in the
genuinely,
video.
I'm just trying to
Let's
learn.
begin with a general overview that
Why'd she
applies to
drop the
both
ball?
games.
That's how you,
General
you have to
overview.
touch, you have to
Rugby,
touch it,
in general,
remember?
is a
You
contact
actually have to
sport
touch
played
the ball
without
to the
pads
ground.
or
I
don't even know
helmets,
how this game
contested between two
goes.
Well, we're
teams
gonna
of
learn.
either 13 or 15 players, depending on the version version of rugby. There are 7-a-side and 9-a-side versions of rugby. These are shorter and faster paced versions of the game that are often played at festivals. Rugby is played on a field that is 100 meters long and at least 68 meters wide. So that's 109 yards long and at least 74 yards wide. The field has markings at various points, and the markings are different depending on the version of rugby being played. These markings do have some significance within each game, but on the most basic level, the markings on the field are your best clue as to whether you're watching Rugby Union or Rugby League. Regardless of the version of rugby being played, the center line on the field is called the halfway line, and the goal lines are called the try lines. At each end of the field is an in-goal area, which is what we would call the end zone. The in-goal areas have a set of uprights that are called goals, and the out-of-bounds area is called touch. So where we would say the ball went out of bounds, they would say it went into touch, or that it's in touch. A rugby match begins similarly to an American football game. There is a coin toss to determine who kicks off, and the team that receives the kickoff attempts to move the ball down the field to score, while the team that kicked off tries to stop them. The team with possession of the oval-shaped ball is allowed to move it by running with it, kicking it, or tossing it laterally or backwards. Forward passes are not allowed, and an offensive team is not even permitted to play a ball that has been knocked or fumbled forward, even if the knock or the fumble was unintentional. You are allowed to punt the ball forward. The punt is often used to clear the ball out, similar to the purpose of the punt in American football, but the punt is also used offensively in rugby, which makes it the closest thing to the forward pass in American football. Just like in American football, defenders are allowed to make contact with and tackle the ball carrier. Once the ball carrier has been brought to the ground, the tackling defender is required to release the tackle, and the ball carrier is required to give up the ball, which usually involves getting it to a teammate to continue play. The rules governing exactly what happens after a tackle has been made differ depending on which version of rugby is being played, and this is the biggest difference between the two codes of rugby. So we're going to be looking at this topic of what happens after a tackle in its own section later in the video. Alright, let's talk about scoring. The objective in rugby is to score points, either by kicking the ball through the uprights, which is called a field goal, or by bringing the ball past the try line and touching it to the ground, which is called a try and is very similar to a touchdown. Just like the touchdown in American football, a try is worth more than a field goal, and after a team has scored a try, they get a free kick at the goalposts, which is called a conversion. A team can also score points via penalty kicks, which are uncontested kicks at the uprights that happen after penalties, similar to foul shots in basketball. The number of points earned by all of these things differs depending on which version of rugby you're watching. After points are scored, the team that got scored on kicks off to the team who just scored. So yeah, they go hard. A rugby player is only allowed to make a play on the ball or influence the game if they are onside. During play, being onside generally means being behind the ball from your perspective. Being offside itself is not a penalty, but it becomes a penalty when an offside player attempts to make a play on the ball or interferes with the game. There are some more specific rules governing offside, including for some set pieces, and those are outside of the scope of this video. Let's talk about that ball real quick. The rugby ball is the same length as an American football, but it is a bit wider and has rounded ends. This makes it a lot less aerodynamic, of course, but that doesn't matter because you're not throwing the ball forward in rugby. In rugby, the play rarely stops except for a few specific reasons. These include, number one, if scoring has happened. Number two, if the ball is moved forward by an offensive player by any means except for carrying it or kicking it. Number three, if the ball goes into touch. Number four, if there's a penalty. And number five, if there's an injury. Otherwise, play pretty much keeps going. So in this sense, it's a much more kinetic game than American football. When play restarts after being stopped, it is generally restarted via something called a set piece. If you play soccer, you're familiar with set pieces. The main set pieces in Rugby Union are the line-out, which looks like this and is how play is restarted when the ball goes into touch, and the scrum, which looks like this and is how play is restarted after certain minor infractions or when the ball becomes unplayable but stays in bounds. The scrum is intensely physical in Rugby Union, and there are strict and specific rules governing the scrum.
What the fuck is that?
The scrum is the only set piece, so it's how play is restarted anytime it needs to be restarted. But unlike the scrum in Rugby Union, the Rugby League scrum is more of a formation than a physical contest, and the team that is awarded a scrum almost always gets possession of the ball. Compare these Rugby League scrums to this Rugby Union scrum. This is another clue as to which version of rugby you're watching. On screen right now are some basic rugby terms and their American football equivalents. This is for you to use as a reference. Take a screenshot if you want. Beyond all this, the details of the game that you watch will depend on the version of rugby that you're watching. But before we get to all that, I want to do a quick history lesson so you can get a sense of why rugby and American football are as similar as they are.
A bit of history.
The easiest way to start the history portion of this video is by acknowledging that most...
Okay. I don't have much room for comedy here. We're learning quite a bit.
I feel like I'm overwhelmed.
What you got? You confused on something still?
I'm confused on everything.
What's you confused about? I hope you. I'm a rugby master right now. I've learned everything.
Especially the most recent thing we just learned. The squirm.
The scrum?
Squirm.
Scrum.
Scrums.
There you go.
Yeah. The scrum.
You're squirming in your chair.
I am, because I'm so confused. And I'm like, wow, I'm not contributing at all to this.
We're learning, though. It's okay. Sometimes it's okay. You know, as Americans, we just shut up and listen sometimes, you know? Which not a lot of people that live around us can say that they do. If we're being honest with ourselves.
Well, what's confusing me is during the squirmage, they're all up against each other, and then what's the whole point of that if the person at the end's just gonna toss it between, like, the guy right on the outside and just toss it through his legs?
Maybe that's because they said the two different versions, like, the one version they're actually, like, trying to fight for it. The other version is, like, it's just sort of a formation. Just to, like, a thing to just get the ball back.
It's like, we're challenging too.
I guess. Well, let's find out some history. Get back into it. 3, 2, 1.
Forms of football played around the world trace their roots back to the football games played in medieval Europe, and medieval England in particular. These games belong to a wider category of game that has been played around the world throughout history, in which two groups of people, and it's usually a large number of people, compete with one another to kick, carry, and or toss a ball or other object into some sort of goal or across some sort of line or into some sort of goal area, almost always through violence. This type of game was already known by the name football in England by the 1300s, and the name football appears to have been in wide use by the 1500s. Today, these medieval games are often called mob football to evoke the chaos and anarchy that define them. And football was often banned by kings and within various jurisdictions due to the destruction and injury that it brought. By the 1800s, this type of game was being played in a more organized way at schools and sporting clubs throughout the English-speaking world, including the United States and Canada. Up until the mid-1800s, each school or club played by its own rules, and these rules could differ greatly, so when schools played against one another, they had to agree on the rules of each individual match. Eventually, standard forms of football developed, and the first one to catch on widely was a version played at the rugby school in England. This is the game that the modern forms of rugby descend from, and it was the version of football that directly inspired what we now call football in America. McGill University in Montreal was the first North American school to base their rules on rugby rules, which had been brought to Canada by British soldiers. Harvard University's football team then learned this version of football during a series of matches between the two schools in 1874. Rugby-style football soon spread to other universities, including Princeton, Yale, Tufts, Columbia, and the University of Michigan, and quickly became the most popular form of football in the United States. In fact, for the first few decades of American football, the terms rugby and football seem to have been used interchangeably. And when we look at the rule books from the time, we see that early American football resembled rugby much more closely than what we would identify as American football today. And even though American football has evolved into its own distinct sport, there are still some vestiges of its roots as what you could call a variation on rugby football. For example, we still call this a touchdown, even though we are long past the point where a player has to actually touch the ball down on the ground to score as they do in rugby. Alright, I hope knowing that bit of history helps put everything into context. Let's go on now and talk about the most significant difference between the two codes of rugby.
The biggest difference between rugby union and league.
As you can tell from the general overview, the two codes of rugby share a lot in common, and the majority of their differences are easily explained. And this makes sense because up until 1895, there was only one code of rugby. The split happened because a group of teams in northern England felt that they were being overlooked by the London-based Rugby Football Union, and also because they wanted to get paid. It seems unthinkable today, but the idea of a full-time professional athlete is actually a relatively new thing. And this topic is interesting enough that it probably deserves its own video. So let me know in the comments if you would be interested in that video. Anyway, so in 1895, that group of teams in northern England created their own governing organization, which eventually became known as the Rugby Football League. And the two codes of rugby began evolving independently of one another.
The public working class illustrated due to players wanting to get paid, which was not allowed by the Southern Rugby Union at the time.
Today, the two codes are different enough from one another that they are generally considered to be two distinct sports. We covered most of the differences between Rugby Union and Rugby League already, but there's one difference that to me is significant enough that I think it deserves its own section of this video, and that is what happens after a ball carrier has been tackled. This fundamental question has a dramatic effect on the strategy, gameplay, and overall flow of the action in rugby. And ultimately, this question defines the distinct personalities of each game. You'll remember from the general overview that a tackled player in rugby is required to give up the ball, and the tackling defender is required to release the tackle. This applies to both rugby codes. What happens next is unique to each game. Let's get into it, and we'll start with Rugby League, because Rugby League operates much more like American football after a tackle. In Rugby League, which again is the one that's more popular in Australia and has the field similar to American football, each team can only maintain possession of the ball for 6 tackles. So this is similar to the 4 downs in American football. But you can think of it as 5 downs because they consider the tackle after a punt or a kickoff to be the 0 tackle. I hope that makes sense. Anyway, in Rugby League, after the ball carrier has been tackled, the defense is required to clear out at least 10 meters and allow the offense to play the ball uncontested. This is officially called the play the ball. So you can think of Rugby League as having a 10-meter neutral zone after each tackle. The exception to this are 2 defenders called the markers, who are allowed to be near the ball, but they're not allowed to interfere, so I guess they're there to keep the offense honest. I don't know. Any defensive player besides the markers who has not retreated 10 meters is considered offside, so they have to get onside before they're allowed to affect the game in any way. In Rugby League, there are no first downs, so a Rugby League offense has to score before its 6th tackle, or else it gives up possession. This means that if a team is on its 6th tackle and is not close to scoring, the team will usually just punt the ball away like in American football. The difference, of course, is that the punt is a live ball in any form of rugby. So if a member of the offense catches it, they can try to score or at least push the ball as far as possible on their final tackle, as opposed to American football where a team fully gives up possession by punting. If a team does not score and gets tackled a 6th time, they become the defense and have to clear out 10 meters so that their opponents can play the ball uncontested. Real quick, because I know it will come up in the comments, I will say that there are a few ways that a team can get a fresh set of 6 tackles, and those are outside the scope of this video.
Which is totally fine.
All right, now we're going to talk about what happens after a tackle in Rugby Union. In Rugby Union, the ball is always live, and it's always able to be contested. So in Rugby Union, there's no concept of uncontested possession or downs, and there's no limit to the number of times an offense can be tackled while they have possession of the ball. If the ball carrier is tackled in Rugby Union and the defender is able to get to the ball before the offense, it's a turnover, which is pretty good on the defender. Because of this possibility, there's almost always a teammate of the ball carrier ready to receive the ball after a tackle. And the defense often doesn't try to contest this handover. But it's also common for the defense and the offense to both engage over the ball after a tackle, which creates a situation called a ruck. The ruck is a vocabulary term and is an official thing in rugby. Once the referee announces a ruck has formed, there are strict rules governing what is allowed to happen to keep things from becoming a violent free-for-all. For example, players are required to remain on their feet during a ruck, and players can only join the ruck from the back, from their perspective. The most significant rule, maybe, is that players are not allowed to place their hands inside the ruck, which means that players need to use their feet to bring the ball to the back of the ruck, and or players need to physically push the ruck or engage with the bodies of the opposing team so that a player at the back of the ruck or from outside of the ruck can pick up the ball. Rucks are often resolved quickly, but sometimes they get extended, for lack of a better term. That's all we're going to say about the ruck in this video. There is a link in the description if you want more information. So that's the biggest difference between Rugby League and Rugby Union, at least to my eye. And it's what gives each of these sports their own personality. Because the offense is guaranteed the ball after most tackles, the action in Rugby League is more predictable and compartmentalized. And it's easy to make sense of it if you're coming at it from the perspective of an American football fan. Rugby Union is more kinetic and is more of a perpetual scramble because the ball is essentially always live even after a tackle.
Rugby League is stop-start.
Recommendations and final comments.
All right, so now that you've got the basics of rugby in your mind, I recommend following this video up by watching a couple matches. If you'd like to start out with a Rugby League match, which might be the better place to start just because it's more similar to American football, I highly recommend the 2015 grand final between the Brisbane Broncos and the North Queensland Cowboys of Australia's National Rugby League, which is basically the Australian Rugby Super Bowl. It's available for free on YouTube. If you'd like to follow up with a Rugby Union match, since that's the more common version worldwide, and it's generally what people mean by the term rugby outside of the places where Rugby League is specifically popular, I might actually point you towards a recent match, the 2022 Women's Rugby World Cup final between England and New Zealand. Both of the matches that I'm recommending are electric and highly competitive and very fun to watch. So they are fun regardless of how much rugby knowledge you are bringing into it. I promise you that by the end of it, you'll have a much better sense of this game. We go. If you have further questions, feel free to leave comments. If this is anything like my Cricket Explained for Baseball Fans video, there will be rugby fans in the comments who will be happy to answer your questions. Again, the comment sections under my videos have been overwhelmingly positive.
Similar to this guy, please do the same for our comment section because this video is done. And we have learned a lot more about rugby now. So hopefully, with a little bit more knowledge, we can go into these other highlights and bits and clips from everything and try to learn a little bit more about it. So
I at least know about squirming and ruckus.
Nope, it's still not a squirm. You're squirming in your chair. You're squirming in your chair.
But I like the squirmage.
Ew.
The squirmage and the ruckus.
With that being said, this video is all done. And if you did enjoy today's video, make sure you hit that like button. Comment down below any more questions about rugby, things that he might have missed, things that we're too stupid to know or understand or talk about. Let us know. Subscribe to the channel. Help out a small YouTube channel because we are still on the road to 1,500 subscribers. If you enjoyed me, follow me on Twitch at twitch.tv/JockoJoker or follow her on Twitch at twitch.tv/IS_gamergirl.
We'll
see you in the next one.